In this episode, we're going to connect transport protocols to privacy in a way that makes the topic feel less like alphabet soup and more like a set of choices that determine whether personal information travels safely or travels exposed. New learners often assume privacy is protected once data is stored securely, but a large portion of data exposure risk happens while information is moving between devices, services, and networks. Transport protocols are the rules that govern how data is packaged, transmitted, and received, and those rules affect confidentiality, integrity, and sometimes even what metadata is revealed along the way. The challenge is that organizations rarely operate on a single modern pathway because they often have a mix of new cloud services, older internal applications, third-party connections, and legacy systems that still need to communicate. When those pathways are inconsistent, privacy intent can be undermined by weak links, like older protocols, misconfigured encryption, or unsafe downgrade behavior that silently falls back to insecure modes. By the end, you should be able to explain why protocol choices matter for privacy, what high-level properties to look for, and how to think about modern and legacy coexistence without letting old pathways become permanent privacy liabilities. A practical starting point is to define what a transport protocol does at a high level, because people often mix up protocols with applications. A transport protocol defines how data moves from one point to another, including how connections are established, how messages are delivered reliably, and how errors are handled. In modern networks, protocols often stack, meaning one protocol carries another, and privacy protections can be applied at different layers of that stack. Beginners do not need to memorize every layer, but they should understand that privacy can be strengthened by protections like encryption and authentication that are built into the protocol or added on top of it. Another important idea is that protocols carry both content and metadata can be sensitive because it can reveal who communicated with what service and when. Even if content is encrypted, metadata can sometimes be observed, which is why privacy engineering considers both confidentiality and traffic patterns. The biggest mental shift is realizing that choosing a protocol is not only about whether data gets delivered, but about how safely it gets delivered and how consistently those safety properties hold across all environments. When you see protocols as privacy safeguards rather than just technical details, you can evaluate them more confidently. The most fundamental privacy property for transport is confidentiality, which means unauthorized parties cannot read the content while it is in transit. Transport Layer Security, TLS, is the core modern concept for achieving confidentiality and integrity for many common protocols, because it encrypts data between endpoints and helps prevent interception. Beginners often hear encryption and assume it is automatically present, but many protocols can run without encryption or can be configured in ways that reduce protection. For example, a web service can use encrypted transport or unencrypted transport depending on how it is configured, and the difference is crucial when personal information is transmitted. Another important privacy property is integrity, meaning data cannot be altered in transit without detection, because altered data can lead to incorrect decisions that harm people, such as changing account details or injecting malicious content. Authenticity is also important because endpoints must be sure they are talking to the intended service, not an imposter, which is why certificate validation matters in practice. When confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity are present together, a transport path is far less likely to expose personal information through interception or manipulation. A privacy-aware mindset treats these properties as non-negotiable for any path that carries personal information. A second major concept is protocol selection for common application needs, such as web traffic, file transfers, email, remote access, and service-to-service communication. For web traffic, the modern expectation is encrypted transport with TLS, and the privacy risk comes from any fallback to unencrypted connections or weak configurations. For file transfers, secure protocols matter because files often contain sensitive records, and unprotected transfer can expose content and credentials. For email, transport protection is more complicated because messages may traverse multiple systems, and encryption is not guaranteed end-to-end unless additional measures are used. So privacy programs must be cautious about what is shared by email and what protections are applied. Remote access pathways also need strong protections because they can grant entry into environments where personal information is stored, and weak remote access protocols have been a frequent source of major breaches. Beginners should understand that protocols are chosen in context, and the privacy requirement is to match the protocol's protection level to the sensitivity of the data and the risk of the network environment. Another point is consistency. It is not enough to secure most paths while leaving one legacy path unprotected, because attackers and mistakes tend to exploit the weakest path. Protocol selection is therefore about creating a consistent minimum standard across all channels. Legacy protocols are a persistent privacy challenge because they often lack modern protections or rely on weak mechanisms that are easy to break. Older protocols may transmit credentials and data in clear text, may not validate endpoints properly, or may be vulnerable to downgrade attacks where a connection is forced into a weaker mode. Beginners sometimes assume legacy equals rare, but legacy pathways can be common inside organizations, especially between older applications and internal services. The privacy risk is that internal does not mean safe, because internal networks can be compromised and insiders can observe traffic. A privacy-aware approach treats legacy protocols as risk to be contained and gradually eliminated, not as permanent exceptions. Containment can include isolating systems that require legacy protocols, limiting who can access them, and reducing what personal information flows through those pathways. Another mitigation is to wrap legacy protocols in secure tunnels so the underlying unsafe protocol is not exposed on the network, though this should be seen as a temporary control rather than an excuse to keep legacy forever. When you acknowledge legacy honestly, you can design strategies that reduce exposure while working toward modernization. Protocol downgrade and misconfiguration are common silent failure modes, and they matter because systems may appear to function normally while privacy protections have quietly weakened. A downgrade can happen when a client and server negotiate a protocol version and end up choosing an older or weaker option, sometimes because compatibility was prioritized over security. Misconfiguration can happen when encryption is enabled but weak settings are allowed, such as outdated ciphers, poor certificate validation, or acceptance of self-signed certificates in environments where that should not happen. Beginners should understand that the existence of TLS does not guarantee strong protection, because the details of negotiation and validation matter. Another risk is mixed content, where some parts of a communication are encrypted and others are not, which can allow interception of sensitive components even if most traffic looks protected. These silent failures are dangerous because monitoring might not immediately flag them, and users might not notice anything wrong. Privacy engineering therefore values strong defaults and enforcement, where systems refuse insecure connections rather than quietly falling back. When the system fails closed instead of failing open, privacy intent is preserved even under unusual conditions. Authentication and authorization also interact with transport protocols, because many protocols carry credentials or tokens, and weak transport can expose those secrets. If a user logs in over an unencrypted channel, credentials can be captured and reused to access personal information elsewhere. Even if credentials are not visible, session tokens can be stolen if transport is weak, allowing impersonation without knowing the password. Beginners should connect this to the idea that transport security protects not only the data being sent, but also the keys that unlock future data. Another important concept is mutual authentication in some service-to-service scenarios, where both sides verify each other, because internal services can be impersonated if authentication is one-sided or inconsistent. Privacy risk increases when service credentials are reused broadly, because a stolen credential can open many paths, which is why identity design and transport security must align. When transport security is strong, it reduces the chance that credentials and tokens are stolen in transit. This directly supports privacy because it reduces unauthorized access that could lead to data exposure even if storage controls are strong. Service-to-service communication in cloud-native environments deserves special attention because it often happens at high volume and can involve sensitive data moving between microservices. Beginners may assume internal service traffic is automatically protected, but internal networks are not inherently trustworthy, and cloud environments can be complex. A privacy-aware approach applies encryption in transit inside the environment, not only at the edge where users connect. It also uses consistent identity and authorization so that one service cannot call another without permission, and it ensures that transport protections are applied uniformly across services. Another important idea is that service communications often include metadata like headers and tracing identifiers used for observability, and those fields can accidentally include personal information if not controlled. When tracing systems propagate identifiers across services, privacy risk increases if those identifiers allow tracking of individuals without strong purpose and governance. Transport protocols and observability practices must therefore be coordinated so that performance monitoring does not leak sensitive information. When internal communications are protected and disciplined, privacy exposure stays contained even as systems scale. Data privacy across networks also depends on how file transfers and bulk data movements are handled, because bulk transfers can expose large amounts of personal information quickly. When organizations move datasets for backups, analytics, or partner sharing, the chosen protocol and configuration can be the difference between a controlled transfer and a mass disclosure. Beginners should understand that bulk transfers should use strong encryption in transit and should include integrity checks so data is not corrupted or tampered with. Another important consideration is access control around transfer mechanisms, because even a secure protocol can be misused if too many identities can initiate transfers. Bulk transfers should also be minimized, meaning only the necessary fields and records should be moved, because minimizing the payload reduces harm if anything goes wrong. Another risk is that bulk transfers can create long-lived copies at the destination, which ties into retention and deletion governance. Protocol choice is therefore not isolated. It must be aligned with data minimization, disclosure governance, and lifecycle management. When bulk transfers are rare, purposeful, and protected, they support operational needs without becoming a recurring privacy exposure channel. Email and messaging protocols present a different challenge because they are often used informally and may not provide strong, consistent protection for sensitive content. Many organizations rely on email for business communication, but email often passes through multiple servers and intermediaries, and transport encryption can vary between segments. Beginners should not conclude that email is always unsafe, but they should understand that email is not designed as a guaranteed private channel for highly sensitive personal information unless additional measures are in place. This is why privacy programs often encourage using dedicated secure systems for sharing sensitive records rather than attaching them to messages. Another privacy concern is misdelivery, where even perfectly encrypted transport cannot prevent a human from sending information to the wrong recipient. Protocol selection cannot solve misdelivery alone, but a disciplined approach can reduce reliance on channels that are easy to misuse. When email must be used, it should be treated as a controlled disclosure decision, with careful minimization and consideration of protections. The key lesson is that protocols matter, but so does the appropriateness of the channel for the sensitivity of the data. Remote access protocols and pathways require strong attention because they often provide entry into environments that store personal information. Attackers frequently target remote access because it can bypass many internal controls if misconfigured. Beginners should recognize that remote access should be designed to be as narrow as possible, granting access to specific services rather than broad network reach, and it should require strong authentication and session management. The transport protocol must protect credentials and data in transit, but it must also be paired with authorization boundaries so a remote user cannot pivot to unrelated systems. Another important concept is monitoring remote access connections for unusual patterns, because stolen credentials are often used from unusual locations or at unusual times. When remote access is tightly controlled, privacy exposure is contained because sensitive systems are not broadly reachable from outside networks. Legacy remote access protocols or outdated configurations are especially risky and should be prioritized for modernization or isolation. Remote access is therefore a domain where protocol choice and access control must be aligned, because the privacy consequences of failure are often severe. Protocol selection also influences how systems handle privacy obligations like retention and deletion, because communication pathways can create data copies in unexpected places. For example, if data is transmitted through intermediaries that log traffic or store messages, personal information can persist beyond its intended life cycle. Beginners should understand that some protocols and architectures create built-in persistence, such as message queues and event streams that retain messages for reliability. That persistence can be valuable, but it must be governed with retention rules and access controls. Another point is that intermediary systems can become places where sensitive data is observed, such as proxies or gateways, which must be secured and managed as data-bearing assets. When protocol choices introduce intermediaries, privacy engineering must account for those intermediaries explicitly in asset inventories and lifecycle plans. This is where the idea of silent failure modes returns, because intermediaries can accumulate data without obvious symptoms. A privacy-aware protocol and architecture strategy chooses pathways that minimize unnecessary intermediaries for sensitive data and ensures necessary intermediaries are controlled and monitored. When data movement aligns with lifecycle governance, protocol choices support privacy intent rather than undermining it. As we conclude, the most important takeaway is that transport protocols protect privacy by determining whether personal information and the credentials that access it can be intercepted, altered, or misdirected while in motion. Strong modern protections like TLS support confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity, but they must be configured and enforced so the system does not quietly fall back to weaker modes. Legacy protocols remain a major risk because they often lack modern safeguards, and they should be contained, wrapped temporarily when needed, and prioritized for modernization rather than accepted indefinitely. Service-to-service communication and bulk transfers require the same attention as user-facing traffic because internal networks and cloud environments are not automatically safe. Email and remote access channels require careful consideration because they can combine protocol limitations with human error and high-impact access. Finally, protocol selection must be aligned with identity, access control, monitoring, and lifecycle management, because secure transport alone cannot prevent oversharing, over-retention, or misuse if other controls are weak. When you can reason about protocols as privacy boundaries across both modern and legacy paths, you are prepared to evaluate real scenarios where the weakest connection is often the one that exposes the most personal information.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.